Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Vivek Bharata. In this video, we'll be covering how to create a proxy server in Node.js and why do we need a proxy server in the first place by looking at a problem we will be facing in the front-end application. Then we'll create a basic proxy server in Node.js with Express framework and integrate the proxy server into the front-end. Even though the current problem in front-end is prevented to some extent, there is a high chance that the hackers or anyone can actually trigger the same proxy server request multiple times to get the data or extract some other information or just blindly make use of that information. So in order to prevent that, we can have caching and also rate limiting to improve the overall proxy server. Let's get started. This is a very basic index.html where it has some basic styles and currency conversion app. And here if you see, click the button below to fetch exchange rates for so and so. So we can ask the user to give the currency code and we can get all the exchange rates for the specific base currency code. And on the button click, we are calling a simple request that is exchange-rate-api.com basics, and this is an API key, latest and base. Let's jump on to the UI side how it looks. Let's host this index.html with http server public command. Once the server has started, it is listening at port 8080. I already opened the tab. Let me just refresh. Alright, so if you see currency conversion app, click the button below to fetch exchange rates for INR as an example. I click fetch exchange rates. So I got all the exchange rates for different currencies for INR. I can also use USD as an example. Now we got all the exchange rates for USD. Clear? Now assume there is a use case in your application as well where you need to rely on the third-party service to get the real-time exchange rates for that specific currency. Let's open the network tab and let's just trigger the request again. Fetch exchange rates. So over here, if you see, this is a request and the response is in this structure. And if you observe clearly, here in the endpoint, there is a key, which is an API key. I'll open the exchange rate API as well. If you see here, so this is the route parameter where you're passing your API key. Anyone can make use of this public API key and can make use of the whole exchange rate API as well with your own API key where you'll be having a subscription fee or whatever the case is, right? So exposing the API key publicly, which is a really bad idea, and this is like a go-to front-end problem, and there's no standard way of preventing this. The best way is to have a proxy server. So the front-end request will call an API to proxy server. Proxy server, as it's a backend, will store that as an environment variable, and from that specific proxy server, we'll call this exact request. So in that way, we don't need to really pass this API key from the front-end to our proxy server. Proxy server will store this API key as an environment variable, and internally it will call the actual request. That's it. So this is like the best way to prevent exposing any API keys from the front-end side. Now let's start with a very basic proxy server. We'll use expressjs for it. And before even that, let me use the other terminal. Let's npm init this folder and let's install these modules, that is express, http proxy middleware and .env. This http proxy middleware will be the main core of the whole proxy server. It has so many features. I'll just give a very brief from the documentation. Let's install this. Then let's start by creating a basic index.js file. Let's import these three modules. And next simple code blocks are creating an Express application port, and we define default port as 3000 and currency API key. And also let's have this .env file and let's have this field currency API key. And then let's just listen at this port 3000. Okay, now let's start building the actual proxy. This http proxy middleware is a very powerful npm module. So let's get into the documentation first. So if you see here, the very basic way to create this is a middleware basically, right? This create proxy middleware, which is imported from the actual module, and over here the target, so to which server the actual request should go, right? And change origin is true, and so this proxy middleware can be attached as a middleware at a very base route, or you can specify only to the /API. That's it. And it has so many features across like path filtering, path rewriting and all. In this video, we'll be covering a few of the concepts to complete our proxy server. Let's create a proxy middleware function separately. And here if you see target, so this is the exact value what I pulled from the index.html over here. Okay, so this is the placeholder and this is the base, like the base currency. So in our actual server code, so for the target URL field, we mentioned the actual server endpoint. And also if you see here, there is another option, path rewrite, which is a function where you can get the path and request object and you can append the extra path or any query parameters. In our case, as per the documentation, if you see here, This USD is like the base value. We need to pass it as a route parameter. Okay. In this endpoint, if you see, there are two route parameters. One, your API key, and the last one is basically the base currency code. Let's jump back to the code. So over here, we are getting the query from the actual endpoint. So what we are doing is we are trying to fall back to the INR as the base currency if at all, if this proxy server endpoint doesn't receive any currency code, and that we are receiving from the base as a query parameter. That's it. Okay. Now let's attach this proxy middleware to a specific endpoint for this example. That would be API v1 convert and this proxy middleware. That's it. Okay. Let's spin this one. And before even that, let's install nodemon as well. And in the package JSON, in the start script, it's called index.js. Okay, let's start. All right. So the server has started at localhost 3000. Okay. I already set up the API request in Bruno application, which is an API client alternative to Postman. So the endpoint is API v1 convert, and the query parameter we are passing with the field as base and the value currency code INR. So let's fire this request. We got a response over here, and this is all the information. Okay. So now let's use this endpoint in the front-end application. In the index.html, let's replace this actual endpoint with our proxy endpoint. With this one, and for this INR value, let's pick from the input, from the front-end input. That's it. Okay. So now let's test this from the front-end itself. Over here, let's refresh. So INR. Okay. If you see here, we got the response also. And if you look at the base URL, that is our proxy URL, and we are nowhere passing any API key, which is not required. So let's test with another core USD. That's it. Okay. I hope this is clear. Now you can say that we have prevented by storing the API key, but there is a high chance that as we are not having any authentication at all, even if we have an authentication, let's say, so any user can still bombard the request by calling multiple times. He can also integrate into other applications and make use of our API key indirectly, right? So in order to prevent that flow also, we can add some more concepts into the proxy server. That is, the first one is caching to prevent the actual request, that is API exchange rates. Let's jump onto the code to add caching to our proxy server. Let's stop the server. Let's use a simple module, that is node cache. Let's import that node cache over here and then define the cache instance, and the TTL is like 60. So cache expires every 60 seconds. Simple. It's like a simple object set and get methods are the helper methods to store and retrieve the cached data. If you can guess, we can use the same middleware concept in expressjs to see if we already have any cache data for the same request endpoint. If so, we really don't need to call this exchange rate API, we can just return from the cache object. I'll just dump the cache middleware definition. It's way too simple. So if you see here, this is a cached middleware simple function, request, response, next, same middleware pattern, right? So first we are getting the original URL from the request object. That is, let's treat that as a cache key, and then we are getting the cached response if at all, if it exists, for this request.original URL, which is a cache key. And also we are checking in this example, apply only for the HTTP verb of get method, and if the cached response is there, we'll just add a logger serving from cached key, and we are just returning the response right away. So when we apply this cache middleware, it doesn't even reach this proxy middleware. Simple. This cache middleware is covering only half part of the caching, that is retrieving and return if it exists. That's it. Now other half of the caching is, as the request is not cached, you need to store the response for the specific original URL in the cache. That will cover in this create proxy middleware itself. So first let's add this cache middleware before proxy middleware. Okay. Now in the proxy middleware, we'll capture the response and store that in the cache. In order to do that, we need to add two more options into this create proxy middleware object. I'll just dump the code over here. If you see here, self-handle response to, this is required because we are explicitly handling the response. Okay, so we have this proxy res as an event handler from this package where we can actually intercept the response, modify anything, and return the response. Simple. So here, if you look at the definition of this block, we have a response buffer, we have a proxy response and request response. So this request and response are the actual proxy entities, like their own respective request response, and this proxy response is the actual response for this request exchange.api.com. Okay, so what we're doing is first we are checking whether the response type is of JSON or not. Okay, only in that case we are just converting the response buffer to string, and that we are caching. That's it with the original URL. Again, if you see, we are getting that from the original request. This request object is again the actual request object for this whole proxy server. So cache.set rec.original URL, which is a cache key, and the data. That's it, which is a response data. Okay, and then returning as is. If this is not the case, we are returning the actual response buffer as is. Simple. Okay, overall, if you look at the pattern, this is kind of a middleware itself, but as this HTTP proxy middleware has this proxy response as an inbuilt handler, we are just leveraging it. That's it. I hope this is clear. So I'll just reiterate. So checking from the cache if it exists, returning will actually apply before this proxy middleware, and to store the actual response from the actual request, we are just using this proxy res handler, and inside we are setting the cache. That's it. Now let's first spin the server and see the difference. Okay, let's go to Bruno and call. Okay, now if you see here, this request took 651 milliseconds, right? If I send it again, now this is only 49 milliseconds. See, 2 milliseconds. And if you look at the logs, serving from cache. Simple. Now as we define here the expiry as 60 seconds, so after 60 seconds the cache will be reset and the request will be called again to the actual server. Let's reduce this to 5 seconds, and the server has started, and as you see this is an in-memory cache, so the moment server starts the cache will be lost. So for the very first request again it will trigger the actual request, which is roughly 655 milliseconds. Now let's do it 46 milliseconds, 480 milliseconds. If you see, we got only one cache request. So this specific request again went to the actual server because we have a TTL of only 5 seconds expiry. Simple. Let's revert this to 60. Okay, now we have covered the caching. Now let's add one more layer which is more safer and highly recommended, that is rate limiting. For this we can use Express rate limiting package. Let's install that. Okay, then let's just import this. Now let's create a limiter instance middleware and we just call this rate limit function, and these are the options for now. That is window in milliseconds, that is like 15 minutes. So this is like the time frame window. So for this 15 minutes, allow only 100 per each IP. That's it. And this 9 lakh notation, usually I prefer to have the calculated value instead of having that 15 into 16 to 1000. I would recommend to just give the calculated value, which again saves some math operation. Let's use this limiter before this cache middleware. That's it. As simple. Let's start the server again. Let's go back to the Bruno. Let's call it. So we got 749 milliseconds, then it is 49 milliseconds, so the caching kicked in. Now we set this as 100, so it kind of a tricky. Let's update this to 2 maximum. Okay, the server has started. Let's call this again. That is like 637 milliseconds. If we call 50, if we call again, we got 429, too many requests. So this middleware limiter has returned this response because we tried to call more than 2 times in this 15 minutes interval. So after 15 minutes, it will be released, and again you can do again maximum of 2 requests. Simple. So this is like a very basic setup. If you look at the documentation over here, we can have like the standard headers, legacy headers. There are like so many other options where you can just go through and configure it accordingly. I hope till this now it is clear. I'll just reiterate the whole concepts what we covered in this video. First, we started with a very basic front end which is already there, where it is actually calling the exchange rate API with an API key which is exposed again, which is bad practice. So we introduced a very basic proxy server with the help of HTTP proxy middleware, and we use this proxy server endpoint in the front end application so that we don't need to pass any API key that will be called inside. Then we added caching layer so that we can prevent calling the same request again in some threshold of 60 seconds. And then we added rate limiting to prevent multiple requests from the same IP in a specific window. That's it. I hope this video is helpful. We can add some more layers to this proxy server, like slowing down the response instead of rate limiting, or a mix of both. And also we can extend this proxy server to an API gateway Let me know in the comments down below if you want a video on how to extend this proxy server to a well-defined API gateway. If you feel this video is helpful, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.